Gaming has come a long way in a considerably short amount of time, evolving in numerous ways, from pixels to polygons and from 2 to 3-dimensional environments. In fact, video games are perhaps the fastest growing medium on the planet, transforming themselves every decade or so into something virtually unrecognisable, always progressing, improving upon pre-established conventions and changing to meet the demands of the market. Over the years, various games have come along and been the first of their kind, introducing concepts or gameplay innovations before anyone else, and generally being the first to do something remarkable. My name is Rach and welcome back to WhatCulture Gaming. Here are 10 firsts that changed video games forever. 10. The first game to use motion capture. Released in 1994, Rise of the Robots, a fighting game published by Time Warner Interactive, was way ahead of its time, utilising CGI sprites instead of conventional pixels in order to create a more realistic aesthetic. While the Mortal Kombat series was using a technique called digitizing to import their actors' movements, Rise of the Robots was the first game ever to utilise motion capture, decades before it would become a widespread practice, in order to create smooth, realistic movements within a virtual environment. The game received a fair amount of criticism upon release, many reviewers believing the game to have sacrificed gameplay for graphics. But regardless, it was the first to do something genuinely remarkable and should be remembered as a landmark in gaming history as a result. 9. The first to implement procedural generation. Released in 1978, Beneath Apple Manor, a roguelike released for microcomputers, introduced the world to procedural generation, a system of creating content automatically using mathematical algorithms as opposed to manually designing every single aspect individually. In the game, players are tasked with retrieving a golden apple from the bottom of a dungeon, navigating rooms and obstacles, and combating monsters in the process. The true potential of procedural generation would only be reached 6 years later in 1984 with the release of Elite, an open-ended space combat simulator. It may not have been the first to use procedural generation, but it was the first to develop the concept into something more meaningful, generating 8 unique galaxies and over 250 distinct planets. Interestingly, the scope of the game did lead to several problems, occasionally generating objects in impossible-to-reach places or trapping the player in distant quadrants of the universe. In some cases, planets were even randomly named after profanities. Who here wants to go visit planet Arse? 8. The first to use animated cutscenes. Contrary to popular opinion, Donkey Kong, which was released in 1981, was actually the second game to feature animated cutscenes. In reality, this particular honour goes to Pac-Man, released a year earlier in 1980, which used cutscenes as intermissions between various stages of the game. Humorous in nature, these intermissions were designed as comical interludes between action segments and served little purpose besides regulating the pace of the game, as well as giving players a brief chuckle. Cutscenes themselves have become a staple in gaming, an easy, functional means to advance the story or move the characters from one location to another. Regardless, Pac-Man was doing animated cutscenes 3 decades before they became the norm, pioneering in ways nobody could imagine. 7. The first to feature power-ups. Making its second appearance on this list, Pac-Man, again the arcade classic released in 1980, was the very first example of a game using power-ups, a practice which would later become popularised by the likes of Super Mario Bros. And Mega Man. In the game, players absorb power pellets in order to become momentarily invincible, allowing them to pursue ghosts and consume them for points. The following year, Donkey Kong would introduce power-ups in the form of Jumpman's hammer, which would allow the player to momentarily destroy battles and fireballs, clearing the path for themselves. Besides that, Super Mario Bros. Is often credited with inventing the quintessential power-up, the red super mushroom, a consumable item capable of increasing the protagonist's size, inspired by its similar application in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. 6. The first to feature QuickTime events. Love them or hate them, QuickTime events, on-screen button prompts which perform actions beyond the player's immediate control, have become a significant aspect of modern gaming. In particular, action games indulge in the practice in order to encourage player involvement throughout otherwise non-interactive portions of the game. In the 1980s, QTEs were a primary means of telling a story, the vast majority of Laserdisc games such as Dragon's Lair using them to progress the action in a forward motion. Really though, these games were essentially just movies with interactive elements, leaving little room for more complex or interesting gameplay mechanics and requiring nothing more of the player than the occasional button press. Yu Suzuki coined the term QuickTime events with Shenmue in 1999, but it was Die Hard Arcade that first bridged the gap between the interactive movies, like Dragon's Lair, and modern cutscene interludes of QuickTime event sequences today. 5. The first to include a New Game Plus. New Game Plus is a feature which allows players to restart their games upon completion using the same character, complete with everything scavenged throughout the previous playthrough, including weapons, upgrades, unlockable items, and equipment. In Dark Souls, for instance, the player is able to restart the campaign once it's been completed, but retains upgraded weapons and levels gained. In some cases, New Game Plus gives players the option of replaying a game minus the challenge, such as in Resident Evil 4. The question is, which was the first? In 1995, the term was coined with the release of Chrono Trigger, but the origins of New Game Plus can be traced back even further, the first actual use of the feature being found in Ghosts and Goblins, a side-scrolling platformer released in 1985, which requires that the player restart from the beginning on a harder difficulty in order to truly finish the game. 4. The first game to depict blood and gore. Violence is an almost fundamental aspect of video games, an unavoidable reality encoded into the very DNA of modern gaming. The vast majority of games indulging in depictions of senseless death and destruction. It's undeniable, and while there are plenty of games that do avoid it, the vast majority embrace blood and gore with open arms, and we love it. Prior to 1986, the depiction of graphic gruesomeness in video games was unprecedented, and while the decade would produce some notably bloody games including Splatterhouse, the first game to get in on the action was Chiller, an arcade game from 1986 in which players would dismember innocent hostages in numerous torture chambers and dungeons, blasting them to pieces using a light gun peripheral. Unfortunately, the game itself was a travesty as well as being a commercial failure. In fact, most arcades refused to even purchase the machine. Can't imagine why. 3. The first text adventure game. Many of the earliest text adventures are a mystery, the games themselves undocumented. As such, Colossal Cave Adventure represents the oldest recorded example of the genre, released in 1976 on the PDP-10. In the game, players are tasked with exploring a mysterious cave rumoured to contain vast treasures, the objective being to acquire as much wealth as possible in a single playthrough. As a work of interactive fiction, the gameplay in Colossal Cave Adventure consists of typing simple text commands, moving the character from one location to the next, instructing them to interact with the environment, collect objects, and access various items located in the inventory. Remarkably influential, the game is considered the first of its kind and is often credited with pioneering the entire genre, as well as influencing aspects of the RPG and roguelike genres. In 1979, an attempt was made to recreate the game graphically on the Atari 2600, and the result is considered to be the first known example of an action-adventure game, meaning that Colossal Cave Adventure single-handedly created two distinct genres: traditional adventure games and action-adventure games. 2. The first game to use WASD and mouse. PC gaming has come a long way in a considerably short amount of time and continues to offer the most diverse, varied gaming experience possible, allowing players to customize nearly everything about the experience, from control preferences to graphical amendments. Still, there are several constants that never seem to change. One of those being the default keyboard controls responsible for character movement, which are pretty much always W, A, S, and D. Surprisingly, WASD wasn't always the default keyboard controls for computer games. In fact, Quake 2 from 1997 was the first game to implement the configuration, the vast majority of previous games defaulting to the arrow keys and permitting the use of WASD only as a secondary option, one which many players ignored or weren't even aware existed. Since Quake 2, WASD and mouse has become the standard, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. It's even now difficult to imagine having it any other way. 1. The first survival horror game. In 1996, the term survival horror was coined by one of the most quintessential examples of the entire genre, Resident Evil. The genre itself, which is defined by claustrophobic surroundings and limited resources, involves maintaining the player at a disadvantage, forcing them to avoid, escape, or contain superior adversaries within an unsettling environment while fulfilling other secondary objectives. Popular examples include Silent Hill, Dead Space, and Alien Isolation, the genre itself transforming considerably in recent years to incorporate more action-adventure elements. With all that being said, it all began in 1981 with the release of Nostromo, a science fiction survival horror inspired by Ridley Scott's 1979 classic Alien. In the game, players are tasked with escaping an invisible alien whilst collecting crucial items and managing dwindling resources, trapped aboard a derelict spaceship. If caught, the player is immediately killed, making it the earliest example of the genre.